today we're holding an event not just to remember George Floyd and many others, but to demonstrate practical ways of elevating black lives. This will be through an exhibition about how the Windrush scandal, which is the latest, ongoing and appalling example, but rooted within a long historical context, of how black lives do not seem to matter to British society.
Those on the Empire Windrush were not invited to Britain, but they had a right to be here. They were British citizens, yet when they arrived, they faced a hostile environment. My parents came in the 50s, recall the signs, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And because they needed work, they did jobs that they were overqualified to do. Indeed, what has changed? This is an important and thought-provoking exhibition that clearly links the past to the present and really makes us think what has changed.
I'm a local resident here in Crouch End. I've been able to get involved in the Crouch End Black Lives Matter group. Lets the wider society know, everyone in the UK, to be aware of what is really happening in this country, to become more aware about what happened with the Windrush scandal, and basically just to keep the message loud that Black Lives Matter is here to stay. It's a movement, not a moment.
I'm a local resident of Crouch End, and as a queer brown woman, I think it's important to stand against all forms of repression. I think this country has a history of racism, and it really needs to be addressed. And I think exhibitions like this are exactly what can help address that issue, because first, we are doomed to repeat history unless we study it.
This exhibition starts with slavery. Portugal and Britain transported 70% of all Africans to the Caribbean and Americas. 70%. Britain forcibly brought 3.1 million Africans to British-owned colonies to be sold and work as slaves in appalling conditions on plantations. Slavery was not abolished by white people in the UK. Thousands of Britons opposed abolition because they owned slaves. Slavery itself only ended in 1834, in large part due to slave resistance and rebellions, not the white abolitionist history that we're taught in school. The apprenticeship period was the first compensation for slave owners and kept formerly enslaved people in bondage for up to 6 more years. In the 1830s, the government borrowed the equivalent of £16 billion to compensate slave owners. Not a single penny of that £16 billion was paid to enslaved people.
Black Lives Matter is a big coalition umbrella organisation, and the brilliant thing about it is that anybody who believes that Black Lives Matter can get involved. And I've really benefited from working with people who have very different political beliefs to mine, or have no political beliefs, different backgrounds to mine, and it's been humbling and educating for me to listen and learn from that.
The next slide is about racism in the Caribbean, which continued even after the end of formal slavery. Because slavery, of course, had transformed the social composition of the Caribbean, and white people continued to dominate as the land-owning class. There are, of course, countless instances of the continuing colonial and racist attitudes after the end of slavery. One example that we can see is from a paper that was read before the London Anthropological Society called The Negro's Place in Nature. A quote from the paper says, "The Negro is inferior intellectually to the European and can only be humanized and civilized by Europeans." Stuart Hall wrote, My first sense of the world derived from my location as a colonized subject, and much of my life can be understood as unlearning the norms in which I had been born and brought up.
When World War I began, people in the Caribbean donated large sums of money towards the war effort. They also volunteered in their thousands. Black men who had served in the war, fought for Britain at the front, served on ships, worked in factories for the war effort, were attacked by white mobs. They and their families were driven from their homes. In Liverpool, Charles Wootton, who's pictured here, a sailor who served for Britain in the war, was killed by a mob in Liverpool docks, nothing short of a lynching.
I was incredibly fortunate to be able to go to a Unite Against Fascism week-long trip to Krakow. It was an educational trip that culminated in a visit to Auschwitz. There's a huge map, and it shows all the different places that Jews were picked up all over Europe. And at the extreme north end lies Norway. A ship called the Monte Rosa picked up 46 Jews. The Nazis bothered to pick up 46 Jews so that they could transport them by this ship into the train into Auschwitz. None of those people survived. After the war, the British got that ship as a spoil of war, and they renamed her the Empire Windrush. And I will just leave you with that.
In 1948, the Nationality Act was brought into law. This said that the Windrush generation were British citizens and had an equal right to life in the UK as people already living there. Many of the Windrush generation wanted to come over to help rebuild post-war Britain and were highly skilled. However, the government did not see them this way, and even before they arrived were treated with hostility. Of those on the ships, most were highly skilled. However, this assumption by the government that they were unskilled and did not belong prevailed. This led to a denial of equal opportunities with education, work opportunities, housing, and so on. For subsequent Windrush generations, this systemic discrimination became entrenched and endemic, exemplified by lower pay, unskilled job opportunities, worse education opportunities, and police violence. Increasingly racist immigration legislation was enacted. In 1962, the Commonwealth Act was introduced that restricted migration from Asia and the West Indies, but allowed migration from New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and Australia. Stop and search between 2018 and 2019, white people were 4 in every 1,000, black people 38 in every 1,000. There is also a timeline here you can look at later that shows you racially discriminatory violence by public and by the police, and some of the riots because of that.
In 1971, the Immigration Act forced people to prove their British citizenship, which led to the loss of jobs, income, homes and benefits and medical care of Windrush citizens. In 2012, the removal of legal aid for immigration cases. Theresa May said the aim here is to create in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration. In 2013, application fees for naturalisation or registration as a British citizen have increased by over 55%. In 2014, the Immigration Act was implemented. This meant that 42% of landlords were less likely to rent to someone without a British passport. 27% of landlords were reluctant to engage with those with foreign accents or names. The Windrush scandal continues, and 112 people have been wrongly detained, 10 of whom have died. At least 18 people have wrongly been deported. Only 3% have received any so far, and only 67% of those have received apologies.
racism needs to stop. You're either anti-racist or you're part of the problem.
And I felt that this was an opportunity to actually get involved and do something practical. It's not enough to kind of feel that racism is bad. You have to be actively anti-racist.
This is one of my favorite quotes from Rani Edaloj's book, which everyone I think should read. We must see who benefits from race, who is disproportionately impacted by negative stereotypes about their race, and to whom power and privilege is bestowed upon because of their race, their class, and their gender. Seeing race is essential to changing the system.
Satbir Singh, the Chief Executive of the Joint Commission for the Welfare of Immigrants, said, "The treatment of the Windrush generation is no accident. It is precisely what happens when an anti-immigrant dogma takes over at the Home Office." Despite warnings, Theresa May chose to create a system that was designed to be as hostile as possible, whatever the cost. A quote from Pauline Clear's daughter, Karine. "I don't get it. You got it documented. Marriage certificate, birth certificate, hospital certificates, everything. Your kids have been to school. You got this one, you've got that one. Hello? Wake up. Who's not doing the work? Who's not checking the paperwork? I don't get it. It was deliberate. They had a certain amount of people that they didn't want here. That's how I feel." We are now about to have a 1-minute silence to remember everyone affected by racism, and particularly today, those victims of the Windrush scandal.
The fact that so little compensation and such few apologies have taken place till date is evidence that the scandal continues and proof that still Black lives don't matter to the UK government.